Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jamie Henkel from PFLAG National. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Learning and Inclusion Manager. Thank you so much for joining us for something to talk about live. And to kick us off, like always, I'm going to bring in and introduce my colleague, my teammate, my partner in crime, Jean Marie Nevada.
Jamie Henkel, it is so good to see you. How are you? And how's Portland?
It's totally the first time that we've seen each other today and not like the fifth on video.
No, we're totally making this up as we go along. Is Portland still in one piece, my beloved city?
It is, and many people have heard about the saga of my mailbox. I now have a functional mailbox, so that's great.
You're back in the mail game along with many ballots.
Yes, all right. You take it away.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, and welcome everybody to Something to Talk About. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National. And every week we get together to have a half-hour conversation about something that excites us and interests us based on current events. So we're having a little bit of a change of pace at the last minute. We were supposed to have on journalist Daniel Villarreal. He unfortunately had a last-minute conflict and could not make it. So to talk about queer media today, I am really, really excited to introduce my colleague, Laura McGinnis. Hello,
Laura. Hi, Jean Marie. Thanks for having me.
Ages since we've seen each other. At least
a long, long time.
90 seconds, 90 long seconds apart, Laura. It's been awful. So for those of you who are joining us and want to play along in our conversation, I encourage you to go to straightforequality.org/discussion series. And the conversation that we are having today is actually about queer media, starting with queer newspapers, but I have a feeling we're going to go to other places. So the article was in Go Pride, written by Russ Foreman. And it was called Community Reacts as Windy City Times Ends Its Print Edition. And the article just went on to describe the fact that the Windy City Times, which started in 1985, is actually shutting down print operations. And this is another queer publication in the very long history of queer publications that we have kind of seen disappearing from print distribution. Right now, there are only about 100 of them in the US, and there are only 11 weeklies. So Laura, I want to talk about this because this kind of stresses me out. So the first question I actually want to ask to you, and I think this could be an interesting conversation for us, because you do media, but you also are a person in our queer space. What role has queer media played in your life?
Oh my gosh. So it is so important to see yourself and have your views reflected by somebody else. And for queer people, I identify as bisexual. I came out when I was still a teenager, and slowly had that whole coming out thing as you're in all of that. And I remember the very first thing that my friends and I did in high school was to print the Rainbow News. We had a newsletter, and it got banned from the campus, and it was fantastic because it was so queer. It was wonderful.
We love queer media, and you generated it.
Right, not well, but yeah.
You did it. But you knew right away. It's funny because I was thinking about it, and I thought, my first real queer publication that I understood was Just Out, which was in Portland, Oregon. I, in high school lived in Oregon, and that shut down in 2013. And I was thinking about that feeling of having that paper in my hand, and it felt so forbidden and so exciting at the same time, because I somehow knew intellectually there were other people like me out there, but to know that they were actually like putting their names on stuff and
right. Well, and finding your community, because as we know, when you are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, you are a person who blends in with everybody else because you fit into every community because you're part of every community. Mm-hmm. So it's not like we walk around and we can, unless you're living in a gayborhood, or a queerborhood, or Boys Town is no longer. They're renaming Boys Town, which is really exciting. But unless you live in a space where everybody is fully out and wearing the rainbow or wearing something, you can't. It's hard to find each other. So you turn to the media to find each other. Yeah. And So not having these voices or having a reduction in the number of voices and the types of voices and where we can find ourselves reflected is really challenging. And then you've got challenges for journalists in general, people who need to work and do a really good job telling stories, and telling fact.
Fact? My goodness.
I don't mean stories as in Once Upon a Time, although there are those people too. But from a journalism perspective, it's really challenging.
And when we think about newspapers, we are obviously thinking about generally reporting facts. But I think when we get into queer newspapers, it actually is more than just reporting the news. We obviously talk about the lens that we put onto things, and that's really important. But Laura, could you talk a little bit about sort of these other functions that these newspapers have played? Because it is certainly giving a specific lens so people understand, for example, let's use Justice Ginsburg, what the passing of Justice Ginsburg could mean in a very queer lens for the queer community. And Jamie is back.
I'm going to interrupt. Daniel is able to join us, so I wanted to pop him in here too. And before we got to the next question, I wanted to interrupt really quickly. So I'm going to bring Daniel into the room now.
Perfect.
Hi,
Daniel, over here.
Yep,
Hello.
sorry, I had an old link, but I'm happy to be here. Please continue.
Oh my goodness. Well, I would love to engage you in this question. So for everybody who's joining us, please welcome Daniel Villarreal, who is an amazing journalist who has just done some incredible work. He's been at Queerty, Newsweek, Out.com, Metro Weekly. I mean, we could go down the entire list. You've been all over the place, both in queer media and in mainstream media too. And so what Laura and I were just talking about was the significance of queer media. It's more than just the news. Could you talk a little bit about the context that it adds to our communities?
Yeah, something I really like about LGBTQ media is it shines a light on other issues that are considered not sexy enough for mainstream media. So there's things like LGBTQ seniors, homelessness, somewhat obscure family laws about adoption, immigration, in vitro fertilization, legalization against LGBTQ issues in classrooms, trans inclusion. So it covers this gamut of things that you won't normally see in mainstream media. The other thing is it also provides a place for LGBTQ readers to connect and comment and organize and actually learn who are the bigger movers and shakers? How can we get engaged and mobilize around these issues? How can we coalesce around a particular event, a personality? That sort of organizing power in community, especially when so many of us continue to feel isolated and underrepresented for so long, is really invaluable.
Yeah, and Laura was talking about, especially in places where it's not obvious who's queer around you. I mean, I always joke I live in Palm Springs. Everyone's queer. So it's kind of easy here. But, for those people who don't necessarily see people like them, that function of building community and doing the organizing while reporting the news suddenly becomes really, really critical stuff. So I want to talk a little bit about, I think all three of us agree that queer media is critical to the survival of our community, and especially those who have the least visibility and who are the most marginalized. However, we are seeing queer media disappear at an alarming rate. So maybe, Daniel, we can start with you. And Laura, I'd love to hear from you too. Why do you think this is the case? We've seen these numbers go down from 100 to down to about 11. So what's happening out there?
Well, so I think part of this is that LGBTQ media and media in general was already having a problem about the epidemic. So I kind of want to start with the epidemic and then maybe go to a broader picture. Basically, the epidemic dried up a lot of advertising dollars. With the social shutdown, basically, no one was going to see movies, no one was buying luxury cars or traveling, hotels, things like that. And all the Pride events were canceled. For some publications, that June advertising blitz can make up as much as a quarter or more of their operating budget for the entire annual year. That means it's a lot of writers, editors, special projects, and things that will never get funded because all that money was just dried up. And keep in mind, LGBTQ publications were already struggling before the epidemic, like I said. So when you think about it, the whole 10% of people are LGBTQ, that's not true, contrary to what we've all heard. It's actually closer to, I think, something about 4.7%. That means that advertisers are already somewhat discouraged for advertising on an exclusively LGBTQ site because they're only reaching less than 1/20th of their entire possible readership. As a result, a lot of the LGBTQ publications are fighting for the exact same ad dollars, which represent an already very tiny slice of the pie. Facebook and Google have also played a weird role in all of this too. I have found it really tough for any publication to figure out how to continue to make money when advertisers are increasingly investing in Facebook and Google so that they can reach thousands and thousands of readers all across all manner of website, rather than focusing to a very specific readership on just one gay website. As a result, LGBTQ publications who use freelancers, the freelancers are getting paid less and less. They have no benefits, and news offices aren't able to establish like sort of correspondence and the sort of in-depth reporting that you would really, really want in order to have a larger view of what's going on.
Yeah. I mean, I actually didn't even sort of think about the financial piece of it, and COVID, I think, dragged it even deeper. Laura, what do you think about this?
I'm 100% with Daniel. I think the challenge too with Google and Facebook, and there have been some reports on this too, are that because they own their content, that anybody who's trying to advertise on them is driven through Google to the site. So you're not necessarily collecting that. Google is collecting that benefit. The site isn't, and they're stripping down that information to themselves. So whether it's media or you're talking about local vendors or local businesses, this is a much broader problem than just talking about media. But when you are looking at media, if there aren't dollars to support the in-depth investigation, which takes time and money to do, you need the resources to invest in what a journalist or a crew of journalists needs to reach the populations, to get the story, to access all of the FOIA information and talk to the lawyers and all of those things. That stuff isn't free, and this is the fourth pillar of our democracy, and it's crumbling. And that's what's at issue right now. Is what we're seeing are, instead of people who are trained journalists, or maybe they are trained journalists, but instead of being part of the Society of Professional Journalists, or RDTA, then you have where like you're standing by a code of ethics, and there's a force, an organization behind you that's saying you really should be practicing the craft in this way, and if you don't, then that's going to hurt your reputation, and your reputation and your credibility is what you trade on. When you have so many people who are no longer part of a system and no longer accountable to anybody else, you have a lot of just crap fake news, actual real fake news.
Literal garbage news.
Actual garbage.
And I think this is kind of following a larger trend that we've seen. I mean, the demise of print media in general, or the decline of print media in general. And I think when you add this lens on top of it and these complications on top of it, it makes the survival of these kinds of publications even more difficult in some respects. So here's ultimately the question that we want to think about. What do we do about this? I mean, what should people be doing? Because the truth is that even those of us who are passionate about print journalism, and I certainly consider myself one of those girls who still likes newsprints on my fingers, I really do. There's something about it. So even those of us who are passionate are people who typically, I'm grabbing my phone the first thing in the morning to check the news. So what should we be doing? What can people do all the time to actually contribute to saving or building, or maybe even sustaining in some cases, this queer journalism and these queer journalism outlets? So it's not just about the journalism itself, it's about the outlets that are supporting the people who did it. And maybe, Daniel, can we start with you?
Oh, sure. Well, I think there's a few things people can do. Foremost, give money to the publications or directly to the journalists whose work that you admire. If they have recurring subscriptions or donation options, use that, and make sure to note when you're giving your donation which writers and features you most appreciate. So money is really the lifeblood of these sorts of things. Yet again, if you have a freelancer, a lot of freelancers have Patreon. A lot of individual authors who are kind of going at different publications, they have cash links and ways to kind of give directly to their craft. And so that can really help make sure that they stay in the game, especially if you think they're doing vital work and that you see that they're doing something that really serves the community. If you're not flush in money, kind of like me, I would say do what the YouTubers say and hit that share, comment, and subscribe button. This isn't just because we like vanity metrics, although we do. This is also because whenever you subscribe to a channel or you share work from our pages, it boosts our broadcast and it boosts the traffic. And more page views will end up being more revenue, which equals more money, higher numbers for us, so that we can attract advertisers and start to attract the sort of revenue that we want. And then I'd say lastly, if you have a publication that you're already reading that doesn't have LGBTQ issues or writers, specifically people from marginalized communities like women, non-binary people, trans people, contact them directly and start to recommend people that you want to see on their pages. Maybe there are people on Twitter or on YouTube or on Facebook or other platforms that you're like, hey, you should really be paying attention to this person. You should really interview them or get them to do some work with you. And the more and more we have that sort of vocal support to editors and managers and newsroom directors, the more they can see, hey, there's actually not only an appetite for this, but resources that we can draw on to help make this sort of content that stays relevant in our community.
Absolutely. I love those. And those are all things that really anyone can do at any point. I mean, the giving money if you have it, but the other things, we're all capable of that. Laura, what do you think? What would you build on?
I think those are actually some of the most important things. There are probably some bills happening in different states, or a number of outlets are actually transitioning to nonprofit, which doesn't necessarily mean that they are suddenly making money somehow. So still absolutely subscribe, absolutely give where you can. Daniel has some really great tips about that. I think what happens otherwise is our fantastic journalists are getting sucked up into corporations and into universities or other large institutions that can pay them. But then what happens is you become part of an in-house media team just putting out in-house stuff. So if you're lucky enough to land at a university, you might still be reporting on really interesting upcoming research and able to give that skew, but you're still giving it under the umbrella of what a university is asking for, or what a corporation is asking for.
Right.
So the risk of not subscribing is we're losing our journalists to becoming just mouthpieces for a corporation potentially. So again, subscribe.
Subscribe. But so I'm going to throw in a question that we were not planning on talking about, but I'm curious because I think that both of you have talked about kind of leads up to this, which is, what do you see happening to queer media? I mean, based on what you're looking at now, based on the changes, both of you are deeply engrossed in the media universe in different kinds of ways. What do you see happening in maybe 5 or 10 years? Do we see a resurgence? Do we see continued falling off? What do you think?
Laura, I'd love to hear your opinion on this first.
I think a lot of people are actually they've moved into things like podcasting or creating their own content. So a lot of folks have moved into being their own content creators. And to Daniel's point, like there are only limited numbers of places where people are going to put their money. So it's really hard, even once you're there, even if you started making a name under your podcast, to continue that as something that your subscribers are only going to pay so much for that, and then maybe 3 or 4 other podcasts or something like that. So it's a hard individual marketplace, and but I think that's we've seen a big surge in that. And other kinds of content creation within other websites or media outlets, like being on YouTube or being individual stars like that.
Yeah. Daniel.
Something because we've been kind of forecasting or reflecting on a lot of doom and gloom, and I think there is reason, of course, to be concerned. But I also want to point out that it's not all bad news. So one very, very small part of the reason that LGBTQ publications are not as thriving right now is because people can increasingly get LGBTQ content through mainstream outlets like TV, online, newspapers, social media. And that means that content producers and executives alike are realizing there is a real market for reading and building upon these sorts of stories. And a lot of indications that that's growing and can create a lot of revenue. I think Laura was absolutely right that a big important part of this is being able to curate your own news experience by beginning to follow some of those people on social media and to show them your support. Truth be told, there's lots of engaging conversations and topics that these LGBTQ journalists bring up on these platforms that will never see the light of day on a front page of a website or front page of a newspaper. And so that's a really good way, I think, to kind of stay not only engaged in it, but news is increasingly following there, where journalists are able to espouse their opinions, to share news that they find, to have discussions about them as they're happening in real time. And I think that you'll see that there's an increased premium on that as we continue to get kind of different types of social media, that allows us to connect. The other thing is I think that LGBT groups, organizations, non-governmental groups and public relations folks have gotten a lot better about working with publications and content creators of all sizes to really help kind of root out anti-LGBTQ people or pro-LGBTQ items in the news. And so in this way, I think it's actually kind of improved that, like, stories that used to be obscure and you would only see them, in kind of a gay newspaper are now kind of, on the front page of, say, the New York Times or like, any other major publication. And so, I do think that we will continue, like, the genie's been out of the bottle, and we will continue to see a lot more LGBTQ content in these mainstream areas. We just know that once it goes up to the mainstream, it tends to get very sanitized. It tends to become very kind of white, cisgender, and very kind of clean and respectable, heterosexual, monogamous centric, cisgender, and we need a proliferation of things that are not that. If there's some gift that I think LGBTQ media has given us, it's the fact that it turns all of those presumptions of what is civil and polite and how men and women are supposed to act and puts it completely on its head, showing other people, LGBTQ, ally, straight, asexual, non-binary alike, what is possible.
Yes. And I think it shows how much better the writing and how much better the conversations are when you have that it becomes these really, really vibrant, unusual conversations and stories that you're not getting in the mainstream. And I think that becomes really attractive to people because once they've experienced it, you do know when it's not there. And I mean, as much as I got excited, like, don't get me wrong, when NBC Outs happened, you suddenly see this mainstream, it was exciting. It still is kind of exciting to see that we've gotten there. And at the same time, I recognize they're not necessarily going to cover all the same stories that we would in other places. I see a ton of comments on the side. So I'm actually going to ask Jamie if she would jump in for a second and share with us a little bit of what the conversation looks like in there.
Yeah, so a question that came up, Jean Marie and Laura, a number of our colleagues mentioned that for them, as queer young people, that LGBTQ media was one of the places that they saw themselves and felt validated. And one person sort of noted that it was where they learned to be gay. Because they weren't quite sure, and so for that was a part of queer media for them. And somebody sort of asked a question following those comments about, do you think that relationship for young people to queer media is changing, or how has it changed? Is it going to change? Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Would love to hear Laura and Daniel talk about that one. Whoever wants to go.
Well, when I was young, the only queer role model I had was Dr. Frankenfurter, Your Picture Project, which is not exactly, what you want to aspire to be. And so, I think that a lot of the younger generation, I don't want to be ageist, but seemingly take it for granted that we've always had this sort of visibility, that you've always been able to kind of live out, and that you were always reflected in media. And, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that's a new reality. That's something that we were fighting for a very long time. And then to recognize that there's a lot of experimentation and growth with that. I mean, we've, yet again, not to be ageist, every now and then we'll hear sort of curmudgeonly folks be like, how many letters are we going to add to LGBTQ? Is it going to be alphabet? Or, like, what's with this non-binary thing, and truth of the matter is that, like, we're getting a bunch of new words in terms of not only who we love and how we identify as gender, in our gender, but also how we do it. And we should welcome those changes and realize that, things like non-binary identities, asexuality, kink, non-monogamy, things like that are actually outgrowths of the same sort of sexual and gender liberation that we had been fighting for decades. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important not only to recognize that, hey, it's going to be different and maybe it's going to make some people a little uncomfortable or seem a little weird at first, but that in actuality, it's a natural outcropping that we should really embrace and explore to understand our own biases and the possibilities that are out there.
Yes. Yes. Laura, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think some of the places that people are going, like the young kids and everything, through like nerd trends, through gaming or other social things. Like I love amino apps. Not that I'm trolling amino apps, but as a social network, I think it's awesome because there are so many channels in that are LGBTQ positive, and they are literally marked as positive. Like these are positive spaces to share news and information and resources and good stories and things like that. And the conversations that happen there and happen in other positive and affirming spaces, you don't necessarily find in the mainstream. And when you have people who are content creating, we had maybe like 10 years ago with folks like Hannah Hart or Tyler Oakley or, like YouTubers who were really coming of age. The ones who were really breaking through were the queer ones. Mm-hmm. And then there were some other mainstreamers that were coming from either big money or, they were coming from a known entity. But the ones who were really breaking through were these, kids from Michigan State or from out in just like creating their own My Drunk Kitchen stuff that is no longer, but like it was queer content creators who were doing that, who were a driving force. And it's because they could own their identity. And that was just part of what the rest of their story was about. And they could bring up hot topics and they could talk about it in a dynamic way that engaged the audience. And then that helped transition, those kinds of conversations helped transition and helped bring about an ability for other queer media, more newspapers or even blogs to recognize that ongoing conversation, the back and forth with your audience is something that you can capitalize on. Yeah. So we're seeing a lot more of that as well. And that's exciting too.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, we've been mostly talking about the way this, the relationship between queer people and queer media. But it's also important to recognize that this whole queer media enterprise has in fact influenced mainstream media, and that we have transformed it in the way that we've transformed any other sector of our culture, where pieces of what the work that happened here have been translated. I mean, and very clearly sometimes we don't always see it as much, but it has changed the way reporting on certain issues has happened. Jamie, do we have time for a couple more questions before we get to our wrap up? Or comments? And you're on mute, Jamie. Sorry.
It's the person. I know how computers work. We probably have time for one more question. And what I'd like to pose to the three of you is, if you were going to recommend one, you had to pick just one queer media outlet to share with folks, what would it be? And I'll give you a second to think about it and share mine right now, which is them.us. Because for me, as a straight, cisgender, older millennial ally, it is a resource that pushes me into places that make me a little bit uncomfortable sometimes. And I think that is really, really important. So for me, that would be my number one.
Daniel.
I would say for me, Autostraddle. Autostraddle is a really, really excellent place for queer women. They have such a breathtaking array of different sorts of stories, from advice columns, astrology, do-it-yourself, mental health, career development, pop culture, you name it. And unlike certain previously lesbian website that shall not be named. There's now a TERF hangout. They're trans inclusionary and non-binary inclusionary. And so it's a really, really great welcoming place. They put in a lot to not only the virtual space there, but also offline spaces with like meetups and things before the COVID era. But it's a great publication.
Thank you. And Laura, quickly, what is your recommendation?
Well, mine was also at Autostraddle, but yeah, I think I still also like the weeklies. Like I love Metro Weekly. I love the Blade. I love all of the Blades.
Yeah.
And yeah, like just take me there. Take me to a weekly. Get my hands dirty. And then also online with them.
Well, thank you. I have to say, Jamie and I share a brain. I actually was going to say them, and it was for the same reason, because it does sort of push me. We are out of time, and I need to get this wrapped up. Daniel, Laura, thank you so much. This was such a fantastic conversation. I think we should do this again and see what happens in a year or so. But thank you both, and we need to get ourselves wrapped up for today. So as we wrap up this week, I want to thank everybody for joining us again. Remember, you can go to straightforequality.org/discussion series to grab the article and the questions and then have this discussion and give yourself something to talk about at home. Just a reminder, it is time to get yourself ready to vote, and we want you to make a plan. So please visit pflag.org/pflagvotes2020 to get your materials to make your voting plan and for you to help someone else do the same. This is how we show being patriotic. We also show being patriotic by wearing a mask because it's the right thing to do. And yes, mine does go with my dress. And so we will leave you with what we do every single week, which is to run fast, to laugh hard, and to be kind. And please, more than anything, wear your mask, even though I can't keep mine on. We'll be back next Thursday with something to talk about. Thank you, everybody. Bye.